Hello, class. Today we are going to be looking at the Civil War. So the Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. Remember, several compromises were passed to prevent a civil war. The compromise consisted of the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, and Kansas-Nebraska Act. However, these compromises did not stop the Civil War. They tried. Also during this time, they implemented popular sovereignty in newly admitted states, causing the Bleeding Kansas because pro-slavery and anti-slavery individuals would run into those states that were given popular sovereignty to try to get those states to vote the way they want to, and they would end up fighting each other. And one of those was um, John Brown, that actually fought and died for slavery. The abolitionist movement informed the public of the horrors of slavery, and we learned about William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. They were abolitionists who used a variety of techniques to free the states that to free the slaves that ranged from publications to actually freeing slaves themselves. The election of 1860 caused the southern states to leave the Union, because that's when Abraham Lincoln was elected, and the South did not trust Lincoln. Although Lincoln promised to only stop slavery in the new admitted states, he told the South that he would let them keep their slaves, but again, they did not trust him. So South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union by capturing Fort Sumter from the Union. So you're going to have several Civil War leaders. I think on your sheet, I only left you space for one of each. But this page right here shows you three. The leaders of both the South and the North faced one of the greatest challenges in the history of the United States. A long, terrible war that divided the nation and sometimes set family members against one another. So if you look at the South did have their own president. His name was Jefferson Davis. Before the war, he actually served in the U.S. Congress. He became president of the Confederate States of America in 1861. At the end of the war, he was accused of treason and put in prison for 2 years. And you have the famous Robert E. Lee. He was offered to command the Union Army, but he was from Virginia, and that's where his loyalty lied. And Virginia did secede, so he became the Confederate general. And then General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, he led his troops bravely in many battles. In 1863, he was accidentally shot and died several days later of pneumonia. We already know Abraham Lincoln. Ulysses S. Grant, he is a general. He will eventually become United States president, and he himself will serve 2 terms. He was responsible for many Union victories. And Abraham Lincoln will go ahead and put him in charge of the Union Army. He was very brutal. He is more like one of your modern generals. He is all about winning and being successful by any means necessary. And then you have William Tecumseh Sherman. He led troops in some of the most important battles of the Civil War. In late 1864, his army marched through Georgia, causing great destruction along the way, and he was able to capture Atlanta, and that secured Abraham Lincoln's bid for presidency, because he did have to run for his second term during the Civil War. So I already said, look at this map. You will see the first states to secede. South Carolina was the first, but all the states in the gray seceded from the Union, starting from Virginia all the way down to Florida over to Texas. Those states seceded from the Union. And then you have your border states, and then your blue is your United States of America. That's the Union. So what was the advantages of the North? Well, you have a large population. It was 22 million people living in the North. 90% of independent goods, especially ammunitions. They had an efficient railroad system. This is important when you're trying to transport weapons. They control the Navy, so they have the sea, which could be used to blockade southern ports and shut down the southern economy because they can't get food in, they can't trade. But they would have to fight a offensive war, meaning long supply lines and unfamiliar territory because they're going down in the south and fighting. However, they had capable military leaders, including Ulysses S. Grant, but it took them a while in the beginning. Their military leaders didn't compare to what the South had. So, what was the advantages and disadvantages of the Confederacy? Sorry. The Confederates had excellent generals too. They had Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jackson. Defending is always easier than attacking, familiar with climate and territory, possible psychological advances. Farmers did fight better than the factory workers. They had a very profitable economy based again on their cotton exports, but they did have disadvantages. They had a smaller population of 9 million. Of that 9 million, 3.5 million were slaves. They had to import independent goods, very little munitions production. If you think about it, those 3.5 million slaves are not going to fight for them because they're fighting to keep slavery alive. So the South will depend on a foreign nation. That foreign nation is going to be Great Britain. Great Britain made a lot of money off of the South's cotton and vice versa with the South in their relationship. So we trade a lot with Great Britain. However, Great Britain has stockpiled cotton as the conflict was escalating. So they knew something was going to happen between the North and South. So they decided just to save up a whole bunch of cotton. They had also found other sources for their cotton, such, India. Most Britain workers who lost their jobs in cotton factories have been able to find work in new munitions factories that were mostly supplying the North. And most Britain citizens resented slavery because slavery had already been outlawed in Britain. And so Britain crop failures had led to increased grain trade with the North. So they really didn't have any investment for themselves to get involved and help the South out. This, like I already said, the South was looking for additional advantage, namely alliance with Great Britain. But Great Britain was wary of events and did not want to become involved. So there are going to be tensions between the North and Great Britain. A British ship, the Trent, was intercepted by the North on its way to Great Britain from the South. It was carrying Southern ambassadors. The North resented Britain's interference, leading some to call for war. However, Lincoln simply diffused the situation by releasing the ship and Southern agents. Because he didn't want to have to fight a war with Britain. He's already still fighting a war in the South. Great Britain had also sold several ships to the South, namely the Florida and the Alabama. They had sunk many North ships. The famous document, Emancipation Proclamation. It freed the slaves only in states that have seceded from the Union. It did not free slaves in the border states, and the border states still had slaves. So as the war was going on, Lincoln only freed the slaves in the states that were rebelling, that were in the South, and he could have freed the slaves of the border states because they were all part of the Union, but he did not. So there were several battles of the Civil War. We're going to look at a couple. You're going to have what is called the Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point. So Lee realized that the South was in dire straits and decided that it was crucial to attack the North on its own territory. So let's go in the North. So he did it from July 1st through the 3rd. 1863 was the Battle of Gettysburg. Confederate bombardment and the Union held firm. On July 3rd, General Pickett led 15,000 Confederate troops across open fields. The Union mowed them down, defeating them. Lee was defeated and retreated to Virginia. Gettysburg is the largest battle in the history of Western Hemisphere. Over 100,000 people died in 3 days. It was the last time the South invaded the North. They knew that they just wasn't successful and they didn't want to do it again. Because so many people died, Lincoln will give his most famous address is called the Gettysburg Address, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause of which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead should not have died in vain, that this nation under God should have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people should not perish from the earth. And that's where we get that quote, government of the people, by the people, for the people, came out of this Gettysburg Address, which describes what our government is today. At the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, more than 50,000 soldiers were dead or wounded. On November 19, 1863, President Lincoln gave a speech at a ceremony to dedicate a cemetery for the soldiers that died in battle. So let's look at there were several new weapons of the war. They were more efficient and deadly. You're also going to have your first metal ships in the world get used in this war. Of course, you have the telegraph, you have the railroads, you have surveillance, you have high-powered weapons, balloons, Civil War guns. All this is going on during this war. So the Battle of Vicksburg was another Union victory. It was won by U.S. Grant. He cut South in half and gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, which is, again, transportation. Grant was then given control of all the Union armies, and he began what is called the Scorched Earth, which I should have learned about that with Napoleon and going against Russia, how Russia scorched earth, so there was nothing left for Napoleon's to live off or feed off, and that's how they defeated him. So Grant did the same thing in the South. He just destroyed everything in the South. He destroyed their crops. He destroyed their plantations, not leaving the Southerners with much to survive on. General Sheridan, he would decimate Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, and then General Sherman, given task of taking Atlanta. His march through Georgia saw total destruction from Atlanta to Savannah. He did the same thing that Grant did, that's destroy. And then you'll see a change where African Americans will begin to enlist in the military. After the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks began to join the Union Army. Initially, they were only used for manual labor, which they were not happy about. The whole movie Glory shows the 54th Regiment of out of Massachusetts and their journey to actually fighting. And their first battle will actually be a suicide battle, so half of them will actually die. But you can see their patriotism, you can see their eagerness to fight for the Union. But in the beginning, they did use them for manual labor. It's a good movie to watch. And this is their attack on Fort Wagner, where the majority of them, even their leader Shaw, will die. All right, so the end of the war. April 3rd, 1865, Grant took Richmond, Virginia. Final blow to Lee's army. Lee surrenders on April 9th, 1865 at the Appomattox Courthouse. All Confederate troops were forced to take an oath of loyalty to the United States. And you can actually go in Virginia, and all this is historical sites that you can visit. Otherwise, terms of surrender were lenient. Lincoln didn't want to basically, he didn't want to humiliate the South and further conflict, so he wanted to be soft on them. They already lost the war. The issues of states' rights now solved. Federal government had asserted its status as the most powerful of the two levels. After 4 bloody years of civil war, the South was defeated. Over 618,000 military deaths during the Civil War. So what was the outcome? Political and economic developments. Without Southerners and federal government, many changes occurred that benefited the North. You're going to have the Homestead Act passed by Congress in 1862, encouraged Western expansion without slavery. 165 acres given to anyone who will farm it for 5 years. That was free land. You're going to have the Union Pacific Railroad was authorized, where you have great trade potential focused on northern states, and tariffs was put in place to protect northern industry. And remember, tariffs are taxes. Congress will establish a single federal currency, same value in all states, known as greenbacks, To cover war debt, the UN government will issue war bonds and introduce income tax, which we pay that now in our paychecks. We pay tax. And a further illustration of federal government power, Lincoln government restricted civil liberties.